Nobody saw this coming. Right after the passing of Charlie Kirk, everything looked controlled, structured, almost too smooth. Within days, Erika Kirk stepped into the spotlight, handling messaging, managing appearances, and quickly positioning herself at the center of everything tied to his name. To the public, it felt like a natural transition, like everything had already been planned. But behind the scenes, a completely different story may have been unfolding. Because while Erika was moving fast, taking control of public perception and organizational direction, another move was happening quietly. No interviews, no statements, no attention, just preparation. And now reports are starting to surface that Charlie's parents may have taken legal action to secure rights connected to his name, not just emotionally but commercially. And that changes everything, because this isn't just about family, it's about ownership. Who controls the books? Who profits from the podcasts? Who has the legal authority to use a name that's still generating massive attention and revenue? And if those reports are accurate, then everything Erika has been operating under could suddenly be questioned. Think about that. A legacy that looked settled, now possibly contested. Ever get hate from Charlie's work? How do you handle it, Charlie? Do you ever feel guilt, or do you ever deal with guilt? A transition that seemed smooth now under pressure, and a quiet move that nobody noticed at the time, now threatening to flip the entire situation upside down. Because if Charlie's parents really did make that move early on, then this isn't just a disagreement, it's a legal battle, and it might already be further along than anyone realizes. To understand why this situation feels like it flipped overnight, you have to go back to those first few days, because that's where the entire foundation of this story was built. When Charlie Kirk passed, the immediate reaction was shock. Not just from his audience, but from the broader political and media space he operated in. He wasn't just a commentator, he was a central figure tied directly to Turning Point USA, an organization with massive reach, funding, and influence. And that's what made the next part so important. Because in situations like this, what happens in the first few days matters more than anything else. Who speaks? Who steps forward? Who takes control? And in this case, that role was quickly filled by Erika Kirk. Almost immediately, she became the public face of everything connected to Charlie's legacy. She was visible, active, and present in a way that signaled authority. She addressed the audience. She appeared in key spaces. She was involved in messaging tied to his final book and ongoing projects. From the outside, it looked organized, like this transition had already been understood internally. And that perception, it's powerful, because once people see someone operating as the central authority, they tend to accept it, especially during a moment of grief where clarity is limited. But here's where things start getting more complicated. Because while Erika was building that visible presence, the actual structure behind Charlie's legacy wasn't something simple. This wasn't just about memories or public statements. This was about a full ecosystem. Books that generate royalties, podcasts with ongoing monetization, merchandise tied directly to his name and image, and most importantly, an organization like Turning Point USA, where his identity is deeply embedded in its branding and influence. That kind of ecosystem doesn't just exist emotionally, it exists legally, financially, structurally, and when someone at the center of it passes, one question becomes unavoidable: who controls it? Now, at first, that question didn't seem urgent, because Erika's presence answered it. At least on the surface, she was acting as the decision maker. She was managing communication. She appeared to have stepped directly into a leadership role tied to Charlie's work. And for many people watching, that was enough. But behind that visible control, there are always deeper layers: legal rights, intellectual property, trademark ownership. These aren't things that get resolved instantly. They require documentation, legal processes, and formal authority. And that's where the timeline becomes critical. Because while Erika was moving quickly in the public space, Charlie's parents were doing something very different. They weren't making statements. They weren't appearing publicly. They weren't challenging anything openly at the time. That silence was interpreted in multiple ways. Some people saw it as respect. Others saw it as agreement with how things were being handled. Some assumed they simply weren't interested in being part of the public side of things. But now looking back, that silence might mean something else entirely. Because according to reports circulating, Charlie's parents may have been working behind the scenes on something much more strategic, something that doesn't happen overnight: legal preparation, specifically tied to the use of Charlie's name. And that's where the entire situation starts to shift. Because when a name is tied to commercial value, books, merchandise, media appearances, it can be legally protected through trademarks and intellectual property rights. And whoever controls those rights controls the ability to profit from, license, and authorize the use of that name. That's not symbolic. That's power, real power, because it determines who can publish content under that identity, who can sell products tied to it, who can speak on behalf of that legacy in a commercial sense. And if Charlie's parents moved to secure those rights early on, then everything that has happened publicly since then might not be as settled as it looked. That's what makes this so significant because it introduces a second layer of authority, one that doesn't rely on visibility, one that doesn't depend on public perception, but one that operates through legal structure. And when those two layers don't align, that's when conflict begins. At the same time, there were already small signs that everything wasn't completely stable. The situation around Charlie's final book raised questions. It was positioned as his last message, something deeply personal and meaningful, but reports began circulating about how much of it was actually completed by him versus shaped after his passing. Then, unexpectedly, the project faced issues. It was pulled, delayed, left in a state that wasn't fully explained. And when a major project tied directly to someone's legacy suddenly hits uncertainty, it raises questions about control, about authorization, about who actually has the right to move things forward. Now connect that to the larger picture. A fast public transition, a quiet legal process happening in the background, a major commercial ecosystem tied to one name, and early signs of instability in projects connected to that name. All of it points to the same thing. This wasn't as simple as it looked because while one side was establishing presence, the other may have been establishing rights. And those two things don't always match, which brings us to where things stand now. A situation that once felt settled, now potentially being challenged at its core, not through public statements, not through emotional arguments, but through legal authority. And when something moves into that space, it stops being a matter of perception and becomes a matter of control. The moment everything shifted wasn't loud. There wasn't a public blow-up, no dramatic announcement, no immediate confrontation. Instead, the real conflict started quietly, and by the time people noticed it, the situation had already changed because up until this point, the story looked straightforward. Erika Kirk stepped forward quickly after the passing of Charlie Kirk. She became the face of the transition. She handled messaging, appeared in public, and began operating as the central authority connected to his legacy. From the outside, that created a powerful impression. Control had already been established. But here's where the conflict begins. Because in situations like this, public control and legal control are not the same thing. And while Erika was building one, another was being prepared behind the scenes. According to circulating reports, Charlie's parents were not inactive during that early period. They were working quietly, consulting, preparing, and potentially moving towards securing legal rights tied to his name. That difference in approach is what creates the entire tension. On one side, speed, visibility, presence. On the other, silence, strategy, legal groundwork. And for a while, those two paths didn't collide. They ran parallel. But they were always heading toward the same point, a collision over authority. Because once you understand what's actually at stake, the conflict becomes much clearer. This isn't just about memory or respect, it's about ownership. Who has the right to publish under Charlie's name? Who controls the revenue from his books? Who can authorize merchandise? Who decides how his identity is used across media platforms tied to Turning Point USA? Those questions don't have emotional answers. They have legal ones. And that's what makes this so intense. Because while the public was watching one version of the story, a smooth transition, a clear successor, the legal reality may have been far more uncertain. Then comes the first major escalation, the book. Charlie's final project was positioned as his last message, something deeply personal, something that would carry his voice forward. It generated attention, pre-orders, and expectations. But suddenly it stalled, pulled back, left in a state that wasn't clearly explained. And that moment, it raised a different kind of question. Not what happened to the book, but who actually had the authority to release it. Because if there were competing claims over the use of Charlie's name, then every commercial project tied to that name becomes vulnerable. That includes publishing, licensing, distribution, all of it. And once that possibility enters the picture, nothing feels secure anymore. That's when the narrative starts breaking because what looked stable on the surface now appears uncertain underneath. And that uncertainty spreads from the book to the organization to every ongoing project connected to his identity. Now, the conflict isn't just between individuals, it's between structures, between operational control and legal authority. And those two don't always align. That's the tension that keeps building. Because imagine this scenario. One side is actively running things, making decisions, managing communication, leading publicly. The other side may hold or be moving to secure the legal rights that determine whether those actions are actually authorized. If that's true, then everything happening in public could be subject to challenge. That's the first twist because it flips the entire narrative. The assumption was the person in control publicly is in control completely, but now that assumption is being questioned because control might not be where it appears to be. And once that idea takes hold, everything changes. Every decision becomes questionable, every project becomes uncertain, every action becomes something that could potentially be challenged. And that's where the conflict intensifies because now you're not just dealing with disagreement, you're dealing with competing claims over something valuable, a name, a brand, a legacy that generates real financial and institutional power. And when that kind of value is involved, conflicts don't stay quiet, they escalate, even if it happens behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the public starts picking up on the tension, not through direct statements, but through signals, projects that stall, messaging that shifts, moments that don't fully make sense. And once people start noticing those signals, they begin asking questions, questions that don't have clear answers yet. And that lack of clarity, it fuels speculation, which fuels attention, which keeps the story growing. At the same time, the organization tied to Charlie, Turning Point USA, sits right in the middle of this because his name isn't separate from it, it's embedded in its identity. Which means any legal uncertainty around that name doesn't just affect individuals, it affects the institution itself, donors, partners, affiliations. All of it becomes part of the equation. And that raises the stakes even higher because now the conflict isn't just personal, it's structural. It's about authority at a level that impacts an entire ecosystem. Which brings us to the deeper layer of this twist. Because at this point, there are two completely different interpretations of what's happening. One side believes Erika's actions represent a legitimate transition. She was closest to Charlie, understood his vision, and stepped in to continue what he built. The other side believes the transition happened too fast without transparent authorization, and the legal move by the parents is an attempt to correct that. Both perspectives have support. Both are being argued, and neither has been definitively proven. That's what keeps the conflict alive because there isn't a clear resolution. There's just tension ongoing, building, waiting for something to settle it. And that's what makes this moment so critical because the first twist isn't a final answer. It's a realization that the story everyone thought they understood might not be complete, that control isn't always visible, and that what looks settled on the surface can be contested underneath. So now the real question isn't just who stepped in first, it's this. Who actually has the power to decide what happens next? And until that question is answered, this conflict isn't going anywhere. And just when it seemed like the conflict had already reached a breaking point, two sides, two narratives, both pushing in completely different directions, that's when things escalated in a way nobody expected. Not louder, but deeper. Because the conversation stopped being about who stepped in first and started becoming about something far more serious. Who actually has the legal authority to control everything tied to Charlie Kirk? And that question changes everything. Up to this point, most people were focused on what they could see, the public appearances, the messaging, the leadership role taken on by Erika Kirk. It all created a clear picture she was in control. But legal authority doesn't operate in the public eye. It operates in documents, filings, rights. And that's where the escalation begins. Because once reports started circulating that Charlie's parents may have taken steps to secure trademark rights over his name, the entire structure underneath the public narrative started shaking. Think about what that actually means. A trademark isn't symbolic. It's not emotional. It's not about who feels closest to the legacy. It's about who has the legal right to say yes or no to any commercial use of that name. Books, podcasts, merchandise, events, media appearances, everything. And if those rights are contested, then every single one of those things becomes uncertain. That's the escalation. Because now this isn't just a disagreement, it's a situation where two forms of power are colliding. Public control versus legal control. And when those don't match, the consequences spread everywhere. The first place people started noticing that impact. The book Charlie's Final Project was supposed to be a defining moment, a closing statement, a piece of content that would carry his voice forward. It had attention, momentum, and financial backing. And then it stalled, pulled back under unclear circumstances. And that's where the shocking reveal starts taking shape. Because when a project that significant suddenly stops, it usually isn't random. It points to something underneath, something structural, something that affects whether that project can legally move forward. Now, no single statement has confirmed exactly why that happened, but when you place it next to the reports of contested name rights, it creates a powerful connection because if the authority to use Charlie's name is in question, then the authority to release a book under that name is also in question. And that doesn't just affect one project, it affects everything. That's when the situation expands beyond individuals because now Turning Point USA becomes part of the equation in a much bigger way. Charlie's name isn't just attached to that organization, it's built into it. Its identity, its branding, its influence, which means any legal uncertainty around his name doesn't stay contained. It spreads into partnerships, into funding, into public perception. And that's where things get even more intense because organizations of that size don't collapse overnight. They keep operating, they keep moving forward. But underneath that movement, risk starts building. Legal risk, reputational risk, strategic uncertainty. And that's not something you can see immediately, but it's something decision makers feel. At the same time, the public perception layer continues evolving because now people aren't just asking what happened, they are asking who's telling the truth. And that question creates a completely different kind of tension because there are two clear interpretations forming. One side sees Erika's rapid transition as strength, as leadership, as someone stepping in to protect and continue what Charlie built. The other side sees that same speed as a red flag, as something that may have happened too quickly, without transparency, without clear authorization. And both sides are convinced. That's what makes this so volatile because it's not just a disagreement, it's a clash of belief systems. And then comes the moment that locks in the shocking reveal. The realization that the early silence from Charlie's parents wasn't absence. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't passivity. It may have been preparation. Preparation for a legal move that operates on a completely different timeline than public reactions. Because filing for trademark rights, preparing legal claims, building a case, none of that happens instantly. It takes time. Which means while one side was establishing control in the public eye, the other may have been building the foundation to challenge that control legally. That's the reveal. And it flips everything because now the early timeline looks different. Erika's rapid rise isn't just seen as decisive, it's seen as something that might eventually be tested. The parent silence isn't seen as absence, it's seen as strategy. And the current situation, it's not a settled transition, it's a developing conflict, one that hasn't reached its final stage yet. Because here's the reality. Nothing has been fully resolved. No definitive ruling, no clear outcome, just an active situation where legal processes, organizational decisions, and public perception are all moving at the same time. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because this isn't the end of the story. It's the middle where everything is still in motion, where every new development could shift the balance, where every legal move could redefine who actually controls the future of Charlie Kirk's name. And that leads directly into the biggest question of all. If this is what's happening now, what happens when the legal side fully catches up to the public narrative? Because when that moment comes, it won't just clarify things, it could change everything. Once the story moved from quiet legal reports into full public discussion, the reaction didn't just stay within a small circle, it spread fast and it split people almost immediately. At first, a large part of the audience accepted what they had already seen. Erika Kirk had stepped forward quickly after the passing of Charlie Kirk. She was visible, active, and appeared to be carrying forward everything tied to his legacy. For many supporters, that mattered more than anything else. They saw stability, they saw continuity, they saw someone close to him taking responsibility at a critical moment. From that perspective, the situation didn't feel controversial, it felt necessary. But that didn't last because once reports about potential legal moves by Charlie's parents started circulating, the tone shifted. The same actions that once looked decisive began to look different to some observers. Questions started appearing where there hadn't been any before, and once questions enter the conversation, they spread quickly. Another group of people, critics, analysts, and even parts of Charlie's own audience began focusing on the legal side of things. They weren't as interested in public appearances or messaging. They wanted to know something more specific. Who actually has the authority? And that question changed how everything was being viewed because now it wasn't just about who was visible, it was about who was legally empowered. That distinction created a clear divide. Supporters of Erika argued that proximity matters, that she was the person closest to Charlie, the one who understood his vision, and the one best positioned to continue his work. To them, the speed of her transition wasn't suspicious. It was necessary. Critics saw it differently. They questioned how quickly control appeared to shift. They asked whether there had been transparent authorization. They pointed to the lack of clear public documentation explaining how that transition was structured, and once those questions were raised, they didn't go away. They multiplied. Meanwhile, the reaction inside the broader ecosystem tied to Turning Point USA became more subtle, but no less important. Organizations like that don't react impulsively. They don't release emotional statements or engage directly in public debates like individuals do. Instead, their reactions show up in quieter ways: internal decisions, partnership signals, messaging tone, and people who follow these dynamics closely started watching for those signals. Because when there's even a possibility of legal uncertainty around something as central as a founder's name, it doesn't just affect one person, it affects the entire structure. Donors begin asking questions. Partners look for clarity. Stakeholders pay attention to risk. None of that always shows up publicly, but it exists, and it matters. At the same time, media coverage played a major role in shaping how the situation was understood. Some outlets framed the story as a family dispute, emotional, personal, tied to grief and legacy. Others leaned into the legal dimension, focusing on trademark rights, intellectual property, and the financial implications of controlling a name that carries ongoing commercial value. And then there were platforms that combined both angles, creating a narrative that felt larger than either one on its own. Because when you mix emotion with legal stakes, you get attention. A lot of it. That's exactly what happened here. The audience didn't just consume the story, they engaged with it. People started breaking down timelines, comparing early actions to later reports, analyzing what silence might mean, debating which interpretation made more sense. And because both sides had arguments they could support, the conversation didn't settle. It stayed active. Even deeper than that, there was a reaction from within Charlie's own community. This is where things became especially intense, because his audience wasn't built around passive consumption. It was built around questioning, analyzing, and demanding clarity. Those were values he emphasized consistently, and now those same values were being applied to this situation. People weren't just accepting the surface narrative. They were asking, was the transition fully authorized? Were the decisions transparent? Does the legal structure match the public presentation? Those kinds of questions don't fade easily. They persist. And when they persist within a highly engaged community, they create ongoing pressure. That pressure doesn't need to be loud to be effective. It just needs to be consistent. Meanwhile, another layer of reaction formed around the idea of timing. Some observers pointed out that if Charlie's parents did take legal steps, those steps likely required preparation. Legal filings, trademark processes, and documentation don't happen instantly, which means the timeline becomes significant because it suggests that while one side was moving publicly, the other may have already been preparing privately. That realization added another dimension to the conversation. It reframed earlier silence. It reframed early actions. It made people look back and reinterpret moments they had already accepted. And once reinterpretation starts, it spreads through everything. Every decision gets reconsidered. Every action gets re-examined. Every statement gets analyzed. That's what keeps the reaction phase alive. Because it's not just about what's happening now, it's about what everything means in hindsight. And that's why this stage is so important, because the reactions aren't just responding to the story, they are actively shaping it. They are determining how people understand the situation. They are influencing how future developments will be interpreted. And most importantly, they are keeping the entire conversation open, not resolved, not settled, still evolving. Because as long as there are two competing interpretations, one based on public control and one based on potential legal authority, the story doesn't end. It continues, and everyone watching it, they are still trying to figure out which version is actually true. And just when it feels like every angle has been argued, every timeline reviewed, every statement analyzed, every side chosen, that's when the final twist starts to come into focus. Not as a new claim, not as a sudden revelation, but as a realization that changes how everything before it is understood. Because up to this point, the entire conversation has been framed as a conflict between people. Erika Kirk on one side, Charlie's parents on the other, a dispute over legacy, authority, and control following the passing of Charlie Kirk. But what if that framing is too simple? What if this was never just about individuals, but about something much bigger? Because when you step back and look at the full picture, a different pattern starts to emerge. Charlie's name isn't just a personal identity, it's a functioning brand. A brand tied to books, media platforms, merchandise, and an organization like Turning Point USA that continues to operate and generate influence long after his passing. And that changes everything, because once a name reaches that level of value, control over it stops being emotional and becomes structural, legal, financial, institutional. And in that kind of environment, transitions aren't always clean, they aren't always fully visible, and they aren't always settled in the way they appear to be. That's the twist. Because it suggests that what we're watching isn't just a disagreement, it's a system trying to determine who holds authority over something that still carries real power. And when that kind of authority is contested, it doesn't resolve quickly, it evolves. Now think about the timeline again. Erika Kirk moves quickly, establishing presence and control in the public eye. Charlie's parents remain relatively quiet, at least on the surface. At the time, those actions seemed separate, unconnected. But now they look like two strategies unfolding at the same time. One focused on visibility, the other potentially focused on legal positioning. And those strategies were always going to collide. That collision is what we're starting to see now. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of signals, projects that stall, questions that don't have clear answers, a growing awareness that the structure behind the public narrative might be more complex than it looks. And that brings us to the most important realization of all. There may not be a single reveal that resolves everything. No one moment where the full truth becomes clear, because this kind of situation doesn't work that way. It unfolds over time through legal filings, through decisions that happen out of public view, through outcomes that may not be fully understood until they are already in place. That's what makes this so unpredictable. Because while the public is debating what's happening now, the real resolution may be taking shape somewhere else entirely behind the scenes, in legal processes, in agreements that haven't been announced. And that creates the cliffhanger, because right now we're in the middle of the story, not the end. The legal dimension is still active, the organizational structure is still adapting, public perception is still evolving, and none of those elements have fully aligned yet. So what happens next? Does one side establish clear legal authority that settles everything? Do the parties reach some kind of agreement that stabilizes the situation? Or does this continue as a prolonged conflict with each development adding another layer of complexity? Because here's the reality. The outcome of this situation won't just define who controls Charlie Kirk's name. It will define how his entire legacy is carried forward, who speaks for it, who profits from it, who shapes what it becomes in the future. And until that outcome is clear, every move matters. Every decision carries weight. Every new development has the potential to shift the balance. So the real question isn't just what's happening now. It's this. When the legal side of this story finally catches up to everything we're seeing publicly, what version of control will actually remain? Now, I want to hear from you because this situation clearly isn't black and white after everything we just broke down. Where do you stand on this? Do you believe Kirk stepping in so quickly was the right move to keep everything stable? Or does it feel like things may have moved too fast without enough clarity? And what about Charlie's parents? If the reports about legal steps are accurate, do you see that as protecting Charlie Kirk's legacy or potentially complicating a transition that was already in motion? This is one of those situations where perspective really matters. Some people focus on public leadership, others focus on legal authority. And until those two fully align, the questions aren't going away. So, drop your honest opinion in the comments right now. I want to know which side of this you're leaning toward and more importantly, why. Also, if you made it this far, hit that like button so more people can join the discussion. The more perspectives we bring into this, the clearer or maybe even more complex this entire situation becomes. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this don't just end, they evolve. And the moment something new happens, you already know we're going to break it down step by step. Stay locked in because if this legal situation continues to develop, the next update could completely change how people see this entire story.